Can anybody hear him?
No.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. For some reason that never flips back. Okay. Make sure this is all set. Okay. So yes, so welcome everybody. I was saying hopefully you get a little bit of sun here. So tomorrow we have our quiz number 4. Quiz number 4 is on chapter 12, which is aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And remember, that's really 2 days worth of material. It's really material from last Thursday and from last Friday where we spent the entire day talking about chapter 12. And then what we could talk about and finish up here this afternoon on chapter 13 on fiscal policy. Okay, so that will be on the quiz tomorrow. You guys know the drill, right? It's the same kind of mixture of problems, short answers, definitions, those kind of problems, right? That will be on the quiz tomorrow. So, I think we'll just kind of save question and answer for tomorrow. But if you have a couple of questions when you're looking over the exam, bring those to class tomorrow and we'll spend a couple of minutes in class. And you can ask questions and we can hopefully get them answered before the quiz in the afternoon, okay? Also tomorrow, we're gonna talk about chapter 14 on the Fed, right? So we're finally gonna get to the point where we can talk about the Federal Reserve and monetary policy, kind of open up this black box. So that will be what we talk about tomorrow. So this afternoon, we're gonna finish up our discussion about debt, right? So we've been talking about fiscal policy, and specifically before break, we were talking about debts and deficits. Okay. So if I can just kind of scroll back quickly through what we were talking about. So after talking or defining what a deficit is and what a debt is, we were talking about, well, why should we worry about debt, right? Why should we worry? And we talked about 3 things. First, that debt has an opportunity cost, right? You have to pay interest on it. And that interest is money that you could have spent on something else, right? Listen, you guys are college students. And as college students, you know, many of you know that that's what you're gonna have to do when you get out, right? Is some of the payment that you make every month is gonna be interest. And so, yeah, you know, that's an opportunity cost of going to college is the interest that you have to pay on any student loans you get. And the same for government, right? If the government borrows to spend, they're going to have to pay interest on it, and that's less money that they could spend on other goods and services. And in the U.S. right now, this is no small amount. About 12% of all government spending simply goes to pay interest on the existing debt. Next, we have crowding out, right, which is an idea that we've talked about before, that government deficits drive up interest rates. And high interest rates aren't good for investment, and what's not good for investment is likely to hurt long-run growth. And so we talked about how, you know, and as you had a question on exam number 1 about this, how budget deficits reduce savings, and savings shift that savings curve to the left. And as the saving curve shifts to the left, that drives up interest rates. And so this is a big deal in many countries. Not so much though in the US, because in the US, we're not a closed economy, we're an open economy. And being in an open economy, we don't have to rely only on domestic savings. We can also rely on foreign savings. And so one of the reasons why the US, despite our big deficits, has been able to maintain relatively low interest rates is because we basically borrow from abroad, right? We don't just borrow from domestically, but we borrow from abroad. And then the third, and this is what we're going to spend a good chunk of our time this afternoon talking about, is debt crises. And debt crises are when governments simply find it impossible to borrow more money. And not only impossible to borrow more money, but impossible to roll over the existing debt that comes to maturity. So even if governments stop borrowing new debt, they still have to roll over their existing debt, right? Those bonds that they have that are maturing, they have to pay for. And so governments are always borrowing in that sense. And if governments no longer can find the ability to borrow, then there's going to be some catastrophes, right? There's likely to be huge increases in interest rates as markets see government bonds as being risky. Governments, they're not going to be able to borrow, so they're going to have to slash their spending. They're going to have, people often will panic sell assets because they're worried about financial stability. You could have a financial crisis and a banking crisis when banks begin to fail because banks hold a lot of these bonds. And so likely you are to have a big recession, right? A big recession. And so these are some of the consequences, right? These are some of the consequences. So why do they happen? Or to put this in another way, can we say something about when debt crises occur? Will it happen when debt to GDP ratios get to be 100%, 110%, 150%? Well, the thing to know is that there is no magic number. There is no magic number about when this is going to occur, right? There is no magic number about when this is going to occur. Instead, when it comes to when a country experiences a debt crisis, you have to think about it in terms of what economists call debt tolerance. Do markets believe that you will pay your debts? That's what really matters. There is no magic number. There is no level of debt that necessarily is going to trigger a debt crisis. It all gets down to market confidence in what markets believe. So right now, Japan has debt to GDP ratio of about 150%. Zimbabwe has a debt to GDP ratio of 20%. Which country is most likely to have a debt crisis in the future? Zimbabwe, right? Because the probability that you have a debt crisis has very little to do with the amount of debt and much more about how likely you are to repay what debt you have. So debt tolerance is really based on what markets believe. And what are these beliefs based on? Right? When markets have confidence that you're going to pay your bills, what is this based on? Well, it's based on a number of things. It's based on your history. Have you paid your bills before? Or have you paid your bills? Have you stopped paying your bills in the past? For example, Argentina has had 4 debt crises since the year 2000. 4 debt crises since the year 2000. Why? Because this has a long history. Argentina has a long history of not paying their bills. And so markets are not going to have much tolerance for Argentina because they simply don't believe them when they say they're going to pay their bills this time. It's also very importantly based on institutions. Do you have the kind of institutions that means that the country keeps their word, right? Or are you the kind of country that has a coup every couple of weeks where there's somebody new in charge? Do you have institutions in which the government actually keeps accurate records and government bureaucrats are not just, thieves, but actually do their job? These are important. Countries with better institutions are likely to have better debt tolerance. To some extent, it depends upon whether it's foreign or domestic debt. And what do I mean by this? Is it debt that is held by your domestic citizens and denominated in the domestic currency? That's what we call domestic debt. So when the US government issues a bond that's issued in US dollars, that's really domestic debt. Regardless of who holds it, it's domestic debt. But many countries simply can't borrow in their domestic currency, right? For instance, Mexico has a hard time in borrowing in Mexican pesos. So how does the Mexican government borrow? They actually borrow in US dollars. And that we call foreign debt. Foreign debt is debt that's denominated in foreign dollars. Which one's easier to default on? Well, neither of them are particularly easy, but history tells us that defaulting on your foreign debt is easier. Why? Because they're foreigners. And because in many ways, international law makes it hard for foreigners to sue people from other countries when they default on their debt. This is one of the reasons why in past world history, what have countries done when another country has defaulted on a debt to them? They've gone to war with them, right? For those of you who are history buffs, you're familiar with examples such as when Britain invaded the Suez Canal in the 1800s. Basically, Egypt stopped paying on their bonds, so England went in and invaded the country, right? They said, you're gonna pay, and we're gonna make you pay with our warships. Right? So foreign debt is actually easier to default on, in part because you're defaulting on foreigners, you're not defaulting on people within your country. Because what happens when you default on people within your country? They get mad. And you're likely to have some sort of revolution or riot. And then I think something else that matters is your budget problems a permanent problem or more of a temporary problem? A permanent problem would be something like low growth. A temporary problem would be more like a recession. And obviously, it's actually better if your country is in a recession and having a debt crisis, because usually what that means is it's a temporary problem. It's easier to figure out a way out of that hole, as opposed to a problem with low growth, which is a much bigger problem. Because if you have low growth now, it's going to be harder for you to pay your debt in the future. So I think the big takeaway that I want you to understand here is there's no simple answer to when a country has a debt crisis. There really is no simple answer. It really is a mix of factors based on history and institutions and their politics and what kind of debt it is and what are the causes of it, right? So, you know, there's no simple or magic formula for figuring out when a country is going to have a debt crisis other than one word, and that is confidence. If markets think you're going to pay your money back, then you can borrow. But the second that markets lose confidence that you're going to pay money back, you can't borrow. And so, you know, where that loss of confidence comes, you know, really depends upon different circumstances, right? I think every debt crisis is a little bit different in that sense, where, you know, many countries, they didn't look like they were going to have a debt crisis until they did, right? Until one piece of information comes out, and then that changes everything. What happens when you have a debt crisis? Or how do you deal with the debt crisis? Well, there's a few things that you can do. You have a few options. None of them are particularly good or easy. Usually you're going to have to do some combination of these things, right? There's going to be some, in reality, you very well might use all of these a little bit. First, you're going to have austerity. And austerity is just a fancy word for cutting government spending and cutting and raising taxes. To reduce deficits, right? Austerity is really the flip side of stimulus. You are going to have to cut your spending and raise taxes. What's the problem, though, with austerity? Anybody have any, you see any potential conflict here? That you're having a debt crisis because you have big deficits. So yeah, we cut spending and raise taxes to cut the deficit, but what's going to be the impact of cutting spending and raising taxes? It's likely to make the recession worse. And we're going to talk about Greece in a couple of minutes in the Greek debt crisis, but this has really been the vicious circle that Greece has been in for a number of years, where they have a debt problem. So what are they asked to do? Cut spending and raise taxes, which does what? Makes the recession worse. And as the recession gets worse and income falls, what happens to their debt? It goes up. So what do they have to do? They have to have more austerity, right? And it's just austerity, 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 austerity as the economy gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And that has essentially been the vicious circle that many countries find themselves trapped in, right? Why do they have to do austerity? Well, sometimes they do austerity in the hope of getting a bailout. A hope of getting loans from other governments or from the International Monetary Fund, which is essentially an organization of developed countries that help make loans to countries that are having short-term budget problems. So the International Monetary Fund is essentially a coordination mechanism where countries can cooperate to give loans to countries that are having some budget problems. But of course, what's the International Monetary Fund going to ask for if they give you a loan? They're really going to ask for austerity and some other things, but they're going to ask you to do austerity. So many countries, in an effort to get a bailout, in other words, in an effort, they're so desperate for money that to get that money, they have to agree to austerity. And as I said, that's one of the reasons why Greece has agreed to austerity year after year after year, is it's really the only way that they can get more loans, right? The only way that countries are going to give them more loans is if they agree to more reforms, meaning more austerity. But unfortunately, more austerity doesn't really help the Greek economy bounce back, at least not in the short run. What else can they do? They can try to renegotiate with bondholders and see if the bondholders will take a haircut. And a haircut just means you accept some of your money back, not all of your money back. For instance, during the Greek debt crisis, most bondholders took a 50% haircut. And by that means they decided to accept half of their money back, and the other half they wouldn't get back. And you might say, well, why in the world would a bondholder only accept half of their money back? And the answer is simple. Getting half of your money back is better than getting none of your money back, right? So many bondholders said, I'll take my loss, give me half the money, and I'm out, right? And so this is something that countries can do too. This is hard though, And the reason it's hard is there's really no way to have coordination with all bondholders. In other words, the way that our international system works, individual bondholders can say yes or no. It's unlikely that you're going to get 100% of bondholders to say yes. And as a result, you have holdouts. There's always some holdouts out there that say, I won't accept anything less than 100%. And so this ends up going through legal systems and courts and becomes a mess for countries to deal with year after year after year. Right? Argentina is still dealing with the ramifications from some bondholders who Argentina defaulted on in the 1980s. Right? In the 1980s, there's still ongoing litigation related to bondholders that Argentina defaulted on. So this is hard. I mean, this is hard. There is one other thing that a country can do. They can inflate it away. If it's domestic debt, meaning it's debt that's in their domestic currency, they can get rid of it through inflation. Right? They can get rid of it through inflation. By increasing inflation, the real value of that debt goes down to zero if you get inflation high enough. Sometimes this is called monetarizing your debt. You basically turn your bonds into money. Okay. So I think a couple of times in this class we've talked about Zimbabwe in 2008, in 2009, right? And Zimbabwe had 100% a day inflation rate. Prices were doubling every day. What in the world happened in Zimbabwe? Simply, Zimbabwe monetarized their debt. They had some debt, they didn't want to pay it back, or they couldn't pay it back. And so what did the Zimbabwe central bank begin to do? They essentially began paying their bills by printing up money. They just printed up truckloads of money and they would pay people's bills, they'd pay salaries. When bonds became due, they would just pay off the bonds by printing up money. And what happened over time? More money, more money, more money, more money. And as the amount of money went up, the value of money went down because of inflation. This is a process we're going to talk more about the next couple of days when we talk about monetary policy. But how do you get hyperinflation? And by the way, I should define hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is technically when you have more than 1,000% inflation a year. Greater than 1,000% inflation a year. This often happens when countries get into debt crises. They can't pay their bills, and so they just start printing up money. They just start printing up money. And as you can imagine, this is usually disastrous for your financial system, disastrous for your economy. This is really no solution, right? This is more of like kicking the can down the road, right? You're not really solving a problem as much as you're postponing the problem. And so as we're going to see, when countries get into very, very high inflation rates, it's almost always because they're having a debt crisis, right? It's the debt crisis that leads to hyperinflation, not really the result, the vice versa. So this is, what happens, what tends to happen during debt crises, right? Is markets lose confidence. When markets lose confidence, what do? They stop lending countries money. What are countries then forced to do? they're forced to do some very painful things, right? They're forced to usually enact a lot of austerity in hopes of getting new loans. They have to try to renegotiate with bondholders, or they have to print up money. In the meantime, you're likely to have financial instability. Maybe you'll have financial market crashes. Your banking system might collapse if you don't pay back those bonds. And you're likely to have a very, very bad recession, right? So to think about, just very briefly, to tell you a little story about Greece, what in the world happened during the Greek debt crisis? Well, a lot happened, but here's the Cliff Notes version of the story. The Cliff Note version is that when Greece moved to the European Monetary Union, they joined the euro, meaning they shared a same currency with Germany and Spain and France. They also had very similar interest rates as Germany and Spain and France. However, the Greeks are Greeks and the Germans are Germans, right? And so as the interest rates between the two countries moved together, it really meant the Germans saved a lot, and who borrowed it? The Greeks, to spend on a very, very lavish social safety net, a social safety net in which Greek men could retire at the age of 55 with a full pension from the government. A Greek safety net in which unemployment was 25%. Many people did not have jobs, and they could just essentially live on the government dole for years and years. And what did this do? This led to high deficits and lots of debt that accumulated quite rapidly. And what did the Greek government do about it? They lied about it. For years, they lied about the amount of debt. They essentially lied until 2009, when a new government came into power. And the new government said, I think they thought that they were being smart by telling the public what was going on, but instead it did not turn out very well. They said, those deficits that we have been saying that they were going to be 4% of GDP? Well, they're going to be 12% of GDP. Sorry about that. And as soon as the government announced that, markets went into an absolute panic, and they had a sudden stop and a debt crisis. And that's basically where Greece has been for year after year after year, for the last 10 years, stuck in the middle of this debt crisis, where they're desperate for money. Who lends them money? Germany does. But Germany says, well, to get a loan from us, though, you need more austerity. More austerity just drives the Greek economy down even more. And you might say, well, geez, aren't those Germans really nice? Right? Aren't they nice to give Greece loans at all? The problem is, who would be the most on the hook if Greece didn't pay back their bills? It would be Germans, right? Because it's German banks that own a lot of that Greek debt. It's German citizens that own a lot of that Greek debt. So in many ways, the German government is bailing out Germans as much as they are Greeks. So it's a mess. It's a long, long mess. Why hasn't Greece tried to reduce their debt by printing up money? Well, this is the other problem. Greece can't print up money because they're part of the European Monetary Union. They don't actually control their own money supply. So by not being able to control their money supply, they've never been able to create some inflation to eat away the value of that debt. So Greece has been stuck. And it's just an example of how debt crises can lead to long, long lasting effects in an economy. And so at this part of the lecture, probably many of you are maybe asking yourself, well, geez, that really sucks. I'm an American. What about us? Are we going to have a debt crisis here in the US? And so let's think about that, right? Let's kind of look to the future here a bit. And to look toward the future, I just want to show you a little bit of data first. Okay, first off, let's think about what debt and deficits are going to look like in the future. This is looking at how much today the US government spends on Social Security and healthcare, and how much by the year 2049 the US government is projected to spend on Social Security and healthcare. And you can see these numbers are going up a great deal, a great deal. Government spending is just going up and up and up. Why? Because we have an aging population. And an aging population kills us in two ways. Older people get more benefits, but they also work less and pay less taxes. And so not only are we going to be spending more on older people, but we're going to be taking in less money through taxes. And so by all accounts, the US government deficit is going to go up and up and up, right? In fact, I think I have a projection here. I don't. Well, I won't pull it up. I mean, you can probably imagine what's going to happen. But yeah, by all projections, US budget deficits are going to go up in the future, if only because of Social Security and Medicare. I have down here, Social Security is actually okay. I know there's something, I saw some poll recently that said that more Americans believe in UFOs than they believe they're going to get their Social Security. No, that's too pessimistic. I think Social Security is basically in pretty good shape, particularly if there were some easy fixes that could be made. The most obvious fix is to raise the retirement age, right? As Americans are living older now, we really should be raising the retirement age more regularly than when we do. So the fact that we haven't really raised the retirement age to keep up with the fact that we have longer life expectancy, that would be a fix that I think would be both fair and would help Social Security a great deal. The bigger problem is Medicare. Why? Because Medicare is not just driven by the fact that people are getting older. It's also driven by medical inflation, right? Believe it or not, we spend 50% of the medical care during a typical person's life is spent in the last 6 months of their life. I'll say that again. 50% of lifetime medical expenses are spent in the last 6 months of life. Medical care is very, very expensive and getting more so. And so it's not just that we have more older people, but the expense of caring for them is going up and up. Part of this is because these new technologies are just very expensive. And life is a normal good. And by that, I mean a normal good is when you get richer, you want to spend more on it. So more people want to spend more on healthcare because that's very important to them. But what it's doing is it's also driving up the price of healthcare, particularly for the government. And so this is a big worry. This is a worry. And until we figure out a plan to try to get healthcare expenses under wraps a little bit more, this is something that really does threaten to really dramatically increase deficits in the future. So, having said all that, does that mean that we're likely to have a debt crisis? We know that future deficits are rising because of Social Security, and particularly Medicare, right? Because Medicare has that additional problem of not only having an older population to deal with, but the fact that medical costs are going up so much. So is the US going to have a debt crisis? Well, the thing is, does the US have a lot of debt tolerance? Do markets believe that the US is going to pay their bills? What do you think? Do you think markets believe that the US government's going to pay their bills? Anybody have an opinion about this?
I mean, I think the other countries tolerate our debt presently, because most of it's, owed to our citizens rather than other countries. So, uh,
Yeah. Well, first off, you have to put your savings somewhere, right? What looks better than the US right now? In other words, it's not just whether the US looks good. The US could look bad, but still look good relative to the rest of the world. And so, I think that is definitely one of the things that's going on here. Relatively, the US looks good. In fact, there's no real substitute for the US dollar. The US dollar continues to be the global international currency. And as long as that's the case, people are going to want to hold a lot of US dollars and a lot of US dollar assets. It still is the safest currency and the safest assets in the world. And if you don't believe that, well, then just what are the alternative, right? What's the alternative? China, as we're going to talk about, most Chinese citizens want to get their money out of China. And for reasons that we'll also talk about later, it's very hard to buy Chinese assets. So China is not a real competitor for the US right now in terms of where people want to store their money, right? Because the Chinese financial system is quite complex, and actually there's really big barriers to getting money in and out of China. Europe, if you look at most of those European countries, they have just as big, if not bigger, debt problems than the US does, and slower growth rates. But Canada's not big enough, right? Canada is only about a fifth of the size of the US economy. I mean, we could keep on going down and down the list, but you just see there's really not a lot of great substitutes for the dollar. And so as a result, markets tend to tolerate a lot of what the US does because the US looks good relatively. I think the other thing, the best testament to whether the US has tolerance is look at US interest rates. Right now, interest rates on government bonds are close to 0% for short-term bonds. In other words, people are lending the government money almost for free. If you lent me money for free, would I take it? Yeah. Should I take it? Yeah. In some sense, markets are really saying to the US, we want you to borrow money. We're lending you money for free. And so, if you look at, for instance, the US pays the same percent of budget on debt payments as it did 20 years ago. In other words, we've been doing this for a long time. Yes, we have more debt, but the thing is we're actually paying lower interest payments. There is no world in which you can plausibly argue that the US is close to having a debt crisis and interest rates are still at 0%, right? Those two things do not match up, right? The fact that the US is paying 0% tells you that markets have a lot of debt tolerance for the US. Then markets essentially believe the US is going to pay back the money, right? So this is actually the reason why many economists say, if markets are going to lend it to us so cheap, why don't we take it? We should be taking it. And we should be investing in things that we need to invest in. like roads, bridges, research and development, vaccines, right? Things that have really high social returns. And so, I think it's strange to say, but the US has never had a period of borrowing as it's had in the last few years. And yet, as the US government has borrowed more and more, I think economists have gotten less and less worried about all this borrowing because the US seems to have this great ability to borrow and markets are happy to lend it to them, right? And so as long as that's true, the cost of borrowing and the danger of a debt crisis is very, very low. But, listen, I'm an economist, so I can't be completely optimistic about this. And to me, the worry is confidence can always be fleeting, right? I mean, to say that markets have a lot of confidence in the US today doesn't mean that something couldn't change in the future and markets could lose confidence. But what is that would cause market confidence to be fleeting? I don't know. It's hard to say. It's not on the immediate horizon. Let me put it that way. So, personally, I think I've seen articles, right? I've seen some of these articles recently, even of people arguing, oh, look at all that government debt. The US is going to have a debt crisis. We're going to be just like Argentina. That's just not a plausible argument. It's just not a plausible argument, right? I mean, certainly markets don't think we're anything like Argentina. And people are betting billions and trillions of dollars that we're not Argentina, right? So, to think that we're close to a debt crisis, despite all this borrowing, it just doesn't look to be on the horizon. Then again, you never know, right? Then again, you never know. And so, and if it happens, it's not going to be good, right? Countries that experience debt crises, they never look back on them fondly. And so that's kind of where we are today, right? Is that, we're in this kind of unusual period where it appears that the US government has a lot of ability to lend, a lot of ability to borrow, and they're taking advantage of it, as probably they should. I think what economists get more worried about is, not that the US is borrowing during the COVID crisis. I think economists get more upset by the fact that even when the economy is good nowadays, politicians still want to borrow money. And that a lot of this money isn't necessarily spent on the most strategic initiatives, right? That instead of spending things that have the biggest social return, such as education or infrastructure, we often spend a lot of money on things that don't have such great social return, such as, I'll just say it, tax cuts on the rich, right? So anyway, that's kind of where we are with debt. So in many ways, probably you're probably getting a happier story from me than you expected, right? You expect to hear when an economist talks about government debt and government deficits, you're going to get, your pants scared off you about the future. But no, I think economists on this are changing their tune. That debt, particularly for the US because of our special circumstances, the US has a much bigger ability to borrow than we thought we had in the past. And so the hope is we don't waste it. I don't know if that's a hope that we should put a lot of hope in, but that's where we are. So, okay, so that really gets us through chapter 13, right? And that really gets us ready for the quiz tomorrow. We have a couple of minutes left here. Does anybody have any questions about the quiz, either chapter 12 or chapter 13 that they found this weekend that they would like to talk about before the quiz tomorrow? Okay, well, hearing no questions, then I will let you all go. If anybody wants to stay on for a minute or two and ask questions, they're happy to do that. If not, we'll be back here tomorrow on chapter 14 to talk about the Fed and monetary policy, okay? So make sure you do that reading tonight and also get ready for your quiz. All right, have a good afternoon. See you, everyone.